It's a classic scene from a certain kind of 80s movie, a protest, a sit-in, a group of people disrupting the system to make a point. But the man at the center of this particular demonstration isn't some rebellious student leader. He's a philosopher. And he isn't debating in a lecture hall or writing in a quiet study. He's on the ground, part of a real-world action that would eventually force the government to defund a controversial university animal research lab. This wasn't just protest, it was philosophy put into motion. That philosopher was Tom Regan, and this moment was the physical expression of an idea that would quietly begin to rewire the modern world. In his work, Regan would argue that we've made a fundamental mistake in our thinking. He offered a concept he called subjects of a life. It's a simple but world-altering idea. An animal isn't just a prop in the grand human epic. They are the protagonist of their own story, with a stream of experiences, with beliefs and desires, with a past they remember, and a future they can anticipate. They possess, in his words, inherent value. But this isn't just a debate for dusty university halls. This single idea has sent ripples into every corner of our lives, its echo visible in the growing number of countries that have banned testing cosmetics on animals. Its influence felt in the quiet boom of plant-based living. The rabbit hole, however, goes deeper, into the places we are trained not to look. It turns out that a staggering 58% of our major banks have no meaningful animal welfare policies in place. And this suddenly extends beyond what's on our plate or in our makeup bag. What does it mean when the very engines of our global economy are running on a kind of moral silence, turning a blind eye to the value of a life? There's a certain way we've learned to see the world, a kind of comfortable arrangement where some lives are central and others are simply part of the scenery. We might tell ourselves that this is just the natural order of things, a practical reality. That the creatures around us are little more than biological machines, bundles of instinct playing out a pre-written code. And for a long time, that was the end of the conversation. But have you ever stopped to truly consider what you're looking at? When you meet an animal's gaze, do you see an empty vessel, or do you get the unnerving sense that someone is looking back? See, because the answer to that question, according to the philosopher Tom Regan, changes the entire equation. His point is that when it comes to a life, you can analyze it from the outside all day long, but that analysis will never provide you with the most crucial piece of information. The answer is only arrived at by understanding that animals are what he called subjects of a life. That concept isn't just a nice phrase, it's a radical reframing. It means that what happens to them matters to them. Each one has a story, and that story is the most important one in the world to the one whose life it is. And this is the point. If it feels like we're only just now waking up to this, think of how it played out not in a philosophy book, but on our screens. For decades, we saw the captive orca as a magnificent spectacle, a living marvel for our entertainment. But then a film like Blackfish shifted the camera's focus, and suddenly, we weren't just watching a show. We were being made witness to individuals, beings with complex social bonds that were being shattered by their confinement. The public reaction wasn't just about bad living conditions. It was a dawning collective recognition that these were subjects of a life whose inherent value was being completely ignored. That groundswell of new understanding led to real-world consequences, like Canada's landmark 2019 bill that banned keeping whales and dolphins captive. It was a legislative admission that their lives are in fact their own. And that leaves us with a truly challenging thought. Once you start looking for the individual with a story that matters to them, you start seeing them everywhere. And it becomes profoundly difficult to look away. Imagine a scene straight out of a blockbuster sci-fi flick. A hyper-advanced alien race shows up, so far beyond us in power and intellect it's not even a contest. But they don't arrive with lasers blazing out of hatred. Instead, they see our entire world as a giant resource depot for their civilization. They start gathering up humans not because they dislike us, but because we're a useful component for their experiments, their food chain, or maybe just their labor force. And when we try to plead our case, showing them our art, our science, our love for our families, they just sort of pat us on the head. To them, our greatest achievements are like a toddler's crayon drawing, charming but ultimately meaningless. Our lives have value, but only in how we conserve them. Sound deeply unfair? It probably does. But here's the uncomfortable part. What if that story isn't really about them, but about us? For centuries, our own way of thinking has drawn a very clear line. Humanity on one side, and everything else on the other, allowing us to see animals as property. But the philosopher Tom Regan came along and basically asked if we're sure we drew the line in the right place. He argued the real question isn't can they reason or can they talk, but whether they are the subject of a life. It's a revolutionary idea that any being who has experiences, who has desires, and a welfare that can go well or badly, possesses what he called inherent value. And this led to his truly paradigm-shifting conclusion that all who have inherent value have it equally, whether they be human animals or not. This isn't some dusty thought experiment for a philosophy class. It's an idea that is rattling the cages of our oldest institutions right now. Think of the legal battles being fought by groups like the Non-Human Rights Project. They're standing up in courtrooms fighting for chimpanzees like Tommy and Kiko to be recognized not as property, but as legal persons who deserve the right to freedom. They're arguing that these beings, with their rich emotional worlds and complex cognitive lives, are not things to be owned. These lawsuits are holding up an uncomfortable mirror, forcing society to stare into it and ask a hard question. Is our long-held supremacy built on a solid foundation of truth, or is it just a convenient story we've been telling ourselves for a very, very long time? We love the clean logic of a moral spreadsheet. It's that old Vulcan proverb, right? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. It feels so simple, so mathematical. You just run the numbers, and the choice that stacks up the most happiness for the most people is the one you make. It's a comforting thought, a world where right and wrong can be solved with a calculator. But someone out there is probably thinking, okay, fair enough, it's not perfect. But let's be realistic. In a world of difficult choices, isn't this the best tool we have? Sacrifices have to be made for the greater good, especially when it comes to something like medical progress. And to that, a philosopher like Tom Regan would say yes, but let me ask you a question about that. When you do that math, who gets to hold the pen and paper? And more importantly, who just becomes a number on the page? An item to be subtracted for the final total? What if the flaw isn't in your addition, but in the entire equation you're using from the start? What if some things are just wrong, not because they lead to a bad outcome, but because they are fundamentally, inherently wrong? This is where the whole game changes. The problem, as Regan saw it, isn't just a single act of cruelty. It's the entire system we've built that frames living beings as resources, as mere tools for our own ends. Suddenly, the question isn't, what good will this do us? But, does this violate a fundamental right? This way of thinking shatters the comfort of our cost-benefit analysis. A utilitarian might see the logic in sacrificing animals for a potential cure, but this rights-based view calls it a profound injustice. And this isn't just some abstract debate in a classroom, it's the quiet revolution in ethics that's pushing for alternatives, like computer simulations and lab-grown tissues. It's the kind of thinking that leads an institution as massive as the US Food and Drug Administration to announce it will begin phasing out some animal testing by 2025, signaling that the ground beneath our old moral calculations is, slowly but surely, starting to shift. Picture a classic neighborhood showdown. It's a scene we've all seen, maybe even lived through. Someone's dog gets loose, digs up the prize-winning petunias next door, and suddenly you have a full-blown feud. The argument that erupts isn't really about the dog. It's about property lines, about respect, about who's in charge. In this time-worn script, the dog is just a prop, a furry piece of evidence in a human drama. If a wrong was committed, we assume it was committed against the person whose lawn was violated. But what if we've been focusing on the wrong character this whole time? As the philosopher Tom Regan suggested, this old script just doesn't make sense. When someone kicks a dog, the idea that the real crime is simply that the owner feels disrespected is an absurdly human-centric view of the world. It's like watching a movie and only paying attention to the extras. The true offense isn't the dent in a person's ego or the scuff mark on their property. The real wrong was done directly to the one who felt the kick, the one who experienced the terror. The animal was never an object in our story. It is the subject of its own. This isn't just an abstract thought experiment. It's a profound shift that has begun to ripple through the real world. You might remember the infamous case of Michael Vick and his dogfighting operation. When the doors to Bad News Kennels were finally thrown open, the public was rightly horrified. But the legal battle that followed was something different. For one of the first times on such a massive stage, the prosecution's case wasn't just about illegal gambling or conspiracy. At its very heart, it was about the staggering, undeniable suffering of the dogs. The law didn't just see them as damaged goods. It saw them as the victims, as beings who were directly and horrifically wronged. It's a quiet revolution in thought, one that asks us to look past the noisy human actors and finally see the silent plaintiff that's been standing right in front of us. You can spend a lifetime having a very specific kind of debate. It's a debate about making exploitation more comfortable, a sort of philosophical interior design for the systems we've already built. We can argue for better conditions, for more humane practices, and it feels like we're making progress. But what if, and I think this is the real kicker, that entire debate is missing the point entirely? Because what if the real question isn't how we treat the beings we use, but whether we should be using them in the first place? This is the radical pivot. It suggests that focusing on welfare is a bit like polishing the brass on the Titanic. It's a noble effort, for sure, but it completely ignores the iceberg dead ahead. The central claim here is that any form of exploitation, no matter how gently you manage it, violates the inherent value of a living being. It's a perspective captured perfectly by a philosopher named Tom Regan, who argued that just being kind and avoiding cruelty simply isn't enough. For him, the real conversation had to be far more profound. In his words, the truth of animal rights requires empty cages, not larger cages. And before you dismiss this as some ivory tower ideal, I'm just saying, you can see the tremors of this exact thinking, reshaping our world. It's not just a theory. It's a blueprint that is slowly becoming brick and mortar. You have entire nations like the United Kingdom, Austria, and Israel looking at their fur farming industries and deciding that some forms of commerce are simply incompatible with their values. It's there in the quiet rebellion happening in the grocery store aisles, the ones you walk down every week, where companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods are challenging the very foundation of an age-old industry. The global plant-based meat market is a multi-billion-dollar signal of a profound cultural shift, a future built not on the better management of exploitation, but on its complete absence, just as Regan envisioned.